After the massive success of Resident Evil 2, Capcom had started work on 3 new Resident Evil games: RE3, led by Hideki Kamiya, an RE game for the Dreamcast, and a spin-off game made in a different style than the previous titles. However, during the development of these games, Sony announced the PlayStation 2, and Capcom goes a little crazy. They pushed Kamiya's Resident Evil 3 to be a PS2 game, and it's retitled as Resident Evil 4. The spin-off game was changed to be the new Resident Evil 3, and then they changed the gameplay to be similar to the old survival horror titles. And because Capcom wanted to release Resident Evil 3 sooner rather than later, they end up swapping the protagonist of the Dreamcast Resident Evil, Jill Valentine, with Claire Redfield, and made Jill the playable character in Resident Evil 3. But before I get too deep into the game itself, I do want to say that I had to dive into a lot of wikis, lore videos, and developer interviews to find out basic plot points of the series. With retcons and multiple endings, it makes going from game to game pretty confusing. I say this because in Resident Evil 2, Chris Redfield states in his journal that the members of STARS, Chris, Barry, and Jill, are headed to Europe to confront Umbrella. And, well, imagine my surprise when I find out that Jill hasn't gone to Europe and is still in Raccoon City. Anyway, so RE3 takes place before RE2, but Raccoon City is still on fire and under attack from zombies. Jill Valentine is trapped in the city and goes for a big escape, and that's where the game starts. The game opens right in the action, just like RE2 did. Within the first few minutes of gameplay, most of the major additions of RE3 are shown. 1. You can now run up and down stairs without pressing a button. 2. Jill can perform a quick turnaround. 3. You can combine ammo powder together to make weapon ammo. 4. There's this weird dodge mechanic that's now in place, and casually, it's a lot harder to pull off than it looks. And 5. The game has now become very action-heavy. A cool thing to note, in the first main room of the game, you're forced to go upstairs to get a key. And the game starts with guidebooks in your inventory that explain all of the mechanics of Resident Evil 3, so all of the changes are explained and showed in the first few minutes of the game. After Jill leaves the room, she ends up in the sprawling streets of Raccoon City, which are covered in fire and littered with zombies. Running around the section of the city, Jill comes across Brad, who was the helicopter pilot from the first game. Brad says there's a monster hunting STARS members and runs off. Jill makes her way to the RPD, and it is very much the same police station we saw in Resident Evil 2. But before she's able to get inside, that's when the big boy himself shows up and kills Brad. It's kind of cool that Brad dies so close to where his zombie self shows up in RE2. It's here where RE3's choice system first shows up. Throughout the game, Jill is offered between picking one of 2 options, which each lead to their own unique outcomes. Regardless if Jill fights Nemesis or runs away, she'll end up in the RPD all the same. Only a few rooms are unlocked, and one of them even has Marvin from RE2 in it. Jill gets to the STARS office where she hears a call for help from the radio, and as she leaves the RPD, Nemesis pops back in. Now, what's great about Nemesis is that he is every bit more terrifying than Mr. X ever was. Mr. X was slow, close-ranged, and once you left the room he was in, that was it. He didn't follow you. Nemesis sprints at you, he has a rocket launcher, and he can follow you into other rooms. He is truly terrifying, since you can't just slip past him and feel safe. He's always on the hunt after you, and he's out for blood. After escaping from Nemesis, Jill unlocks access to more of the city. The original idea of RE3 was to focus on more outside exploration, opposed to Resident Evil 1 and 2, which mainly take place indoors. So as the city opens up more, you can take one of 2 routes. Either go to the Daily Bugle first, or go to a restaurant. Either way, regardless of which building you go into, Jill will run into Carlos, a mercenary hired by Umbrella, and he was the guy on the radio calling for assistance. Nemesis then shows up at whichever building you meet Carlos in, and the 2 escape the monster. Then Carlos suggests that Jill and him team up. The second building you go to will have a gem. With that gem, plus another gem that's collected at the RPD, another part of the city will unlock, which is where the trolley car is. The trolley is where Carlos and the remaining mercenaries are holed up. Jill is then tasked with collecting 3 items needed to get the trolley car working. Now we get to the backtracking part of the game, which has the most collect an item, put an item here, resi goodness we've gotten so far in RE3. Each item is located in its own section, which houses its own puzzles, cutscenes, and mobs of enemies, including the Drain Demos, which are new to the series but aren't anything special. While collecting these items, Nemesis can show up, which adds a lot of tension to going through the city. After getting all the items, the trolley is fixed and the mercenaries and Jill head off for a clock tower where an evac helicopter awaits them. However, Nemesis shows up again, and that leads the trolley crashing into the clock tower with only Jill and Carlos surviving. This area is the most like classic Resident Evil. We're 3 games in now and I'm already using classic Resident Evil. Anyway, it's indoors, there are a lot more puzzles here, and there's also giant spiders. I don't know what's up with Resident Evil and giant spiders, but I guess you gotta have giant spiders in a Resident Evil game. The clock tower is short and pretty linear. Keys now usually only open one door, then are discarded. After ringing the bell of the clock tower, the helicopter comes to rescue Jill and Carlos. Nemesis shoots down the helicopter and infects Jill with the zombie virus. And following that, a fight against Nemesis occurs, and that fight is one of, if not my most, hated fights in all of Resident Evil. So, if you start the clock tower section by using the emergency brake on the trolley, Carlos will help out during this fight by destroying Nemesis's rocket launcher. If you choose to jump out of the window, this fight is even worse than usual since Carlos doesn't show up. This fight is just so bad. Nemesis has such fast, hard-hitting, long-ranged moves plus grab attacks that this fight is the reason that sometimes I'll look at RE3, be about to play it, remember the fight exists, and then decide not to play RE3 and go do something else instead. After that fight, Nemesis falls into some fire and Jill passes out. A few days passed and it's now post-Resident Evil 2. And now you play as Carlos, who uses a machine gun, a weapon Jill doesn't have access to at this point. And he runs to a nearby hospital to find a cure for Jill. The hospital brings back hunters from RE1 and also Nikolai, a character I forgot to talk about. I'm not going to. Anyway, Carlos' section has some good puzzles and utilizes the different floors and rooms of the hospital pretty well, having you move between different rooms to solve one puzzle, and also having a reasonable water puzzle that's a lot more than just plugging in some numbers. Carlos then escapes the exploding hospital, having gotten the cure for the virus. He then runs back to the clock tower and cures Jill, then dips. We now are controlling Jill again, and the next stop is the park, which feels more like a zoo to me, but whatever. The park is really linear. It kind of only has a left path and a right path, but you need to run all the way down the right passage to the dead end to get a key needed to unlock the door all the way at the end of the left passage. What's kind of neat about the park is there's rooms that have random enemies in them. You could get zombies in a room, or they could be hunters, or who knows. Eventually, Jill gets to a shack where a bunch of Umbrella employees were murdered by Nikolai. Again, he doesn't matter, because now it's time to fight a giant worm. After the giant worm fight, Jill heads for an Umbrella waste site, which is the final area of the game. Nemesis shows up again, and this choice determines how you enter the facility, plus the fate of Nikolai. Jill runs around the area doing the usual Resident Evil stuff. The infamous water puzzle happens here, but I actually like it. I don't know. I enjoy the types of puzzles that are more complicated than the usual push a block thing. Since this is the last puzzle of note, I do kind of want to talk about puzzles in Resident Evil 3. What's cool about them is that most of the puzzles have around 4 different answers associated with them, so there's a chance that the puzzle will be different on repeat playthroughs. So if the answer to one of these puzzles was 4011 on this playthrough, the next time you play Resident Evil 3, there's a chance that the solution to that puzzle will not be 4011. It could be something totally different, like 1032 or whatever. And I believe that these Resident Evil games are made to be replayed, so whatever makes replaying the games more interesting makes them better. At least in my opinion. Anyway, back to the game. Jill has another one-on-one fight against Nemesis, but here Nemesis moves a lot slower. And Jill isn't infected, so you can see her HP a lot better. And at this point, Nikolai was either killed by Nemesis, or he stole the escape helicopter. Either way, he doesn't matter, and Jill needs to find her own way to get out of the facility because a missile is coming to blow up all of Raccoon City. The key card acquired after beating Nemesis can be used to open the way out of the facility, or it can be used to get a hidden rocket launcher first. Regardless of which option you pick, only one thing stands between Jill and her escape from Raccoon City, and that's the final fight with Nemesis. Once Nemesis is damaged enough, it can be hit by a giant railgun, and then the final option is given at the end of the game. Either have Jill say the coolest line in Resident Evil history, or I do not know. I have never picked the other option.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
And finally, Jill runs into Carlos, the two find a helicopter, and then escape, just as a missile comes and blows up all of the city, with the game ending on yet another line about how they're going to take out Umbrella. Resident Evil 3 is a lot shorter, or at least feels a lot shorter than the previous titles. It makes up for its length by having different cutscenes and encounters based on what choices you picked throughout the playthrough, along with the puzzles that change solutions every time too. And just like RE2, you're ranked on how well you played, and the higher the rank, the more costumes you'll unlock on repeat playthroughs. Resident Evil 3 also has epilogues, and each new completion unlocks a different epilogue for a different character. Nemesis was also a great addition, and while I absolutely hate the clock tower fight, I think every other encounter with him is great. You can actually take down Nemesis at times if you wanted to, but I personally never found the rewards to be worth the ammo investment. It is cool that you can take him down though. Being able to craft ammo is also a really neat addition, and item placement is also randomized to a degree. Weapons like the Magnum and grenade launcher can spawn in different places, and sometimes healing items might be in one area on one playthrough, but be completely absent in another. There's a lot of new stuff in Resident Evil 3 that I think is great. The ammo crafting, the running up and down stairs, the quick turn, all fantastic additions. Not to jump too far ahead, but the theme of action and killing zombies and over-the-top monsters and having soap opera style betrayals only grows with each passing entry of this Resident Evil series. Another similarity I've seen is that the games have continued to get more linear after the halfway point. By the third game in the series, Resident Evil seems to be leaning more and more on action, and the linearity and action focus is something to keep in mind as we keep moving forward throughout these games. With the last of the PS1 RE games out of the way though, the next stop is the next generation of consoles and the new horror adventures that they promise to bring.